So I would like to welcome everyone to this session. What we are going to be doing today, and I'm going to share my screen, is we are going to be talking about experiential learning and how it is as Jewish as the Torah itself. Let me jump in with my screen share. And if I can just get in the chat, if you can give me a thumbs up to let me know that you can see my screen, would be perfect. Thank you. So something that I have noticed and I've been exploring is this idea of kind of Torah and Judaism and God as an educator as something that is really akin to what we consider an up-and-coming field in the Jewish educational world around experiential Jewish education. But really, if we dig into our texts and kind of the origins of who we are as a people, we will see that we are very much a voting with our feet and really interactive and direct connection and multi-methodology based type of community and type of learning. And the way in which the Torah is structured is it asks you to use all of your senses and think of what you need as an individual and what you as an individual can do to connect to the collective. So I am Eliana Leader. I'm the director of the Retreat Center at Ramat Darom. And what we do at Ramat Darom is we spend a lot of time thinking about and designing experiences that really ask individuals to take steps on their Jewish journey and to think through how they would like to see themselves connect to Torah in a very personal way and connect to Jewish living in a very personal way, in the way that speaks to them, and be able to manifest that for themselves through a communal experience. So in doing so, I want to take a moment for you to all think, and for those who would like to share in the chat, you are welcome to do so, to think about what is in a name, right? A name is your name is oftentimes the starting point of your own story, your own origin story. And many times it is the start of the connection to your Jewish story or your Jewish community. And so if you take a moment and you think about the origin story of your name, where did your name come from? Why were you named what you were named? Do you go by a Hebrew name or an English name? What does it mean to you? Do you love your name? Do you have tension with your name? Do you go by a nickname? Does that nickname feel stronger to you than the name that you were given? And then thinking through that question, which you may have thought about a lot, or you may have never thought of, how might that name connect to your own spiritual identity? Have you ever thought through how your name and the origin of where you start, that moment that you became an individual, and that space where you got your own independent identity from the collective, how has that started a spiritual path for you? How has it perhaps impacted your ability to move forward on that spiritual path? Has it created a blockage for you? Is it perhaps, and I'll say as it is for me, sometimes your last name, your collective name, your communal name, that sometimes has a tension point or a strength there that you never expected necessarily to connect to. And in your own Jewish journey or in your personal journey, it's really manifested. And then in thinking through that, how does your name connect you to others? Even though it's your name and your individual name and you're your own unique person, how has that name bound you either to those who gave you that name, to those who that name came from, if you were named after someone, How might it be a connection to those who come after you, if you choose to have children or if you have children? How might your name impact them? And what are you giving to another generation? And so how are you connected as an individual and then to the collective? And so I've said those things slowly so that if you would like to share in the chat, please do so. I'm going to share my name. My name is Eliana Rachel Leader. I am the only person in my family who was only given one set of names. I have just Hebrew names and I do not have English names. I was actually named after a great rabbi, Rabbi Elchanan Wasserman, who I am the cousin of. And he had one child, Reb Simcha Wasserman, and Reb Simcha did not end up having any children. So we were the last of his family's line who identified as Jewish and was living. And in order to honor Reb Elchanan, my parents named me Eliana. The other piece to my name is that my name, Eliana, means God has answered me. And my mother had actually had a miscarriage right before I was born. Before me, she had had a miscarriage and she wasn't sure she was going to be able to have another child. And not only was she able to give birth successfully after that miscarriage, but I was a girl and she was sure that she was always only going to have boys because she only had brothers, and obviously it does not work that way, but mentally she only thought about the fact that she's used to only having brothers, so she imagined herself only having sons. I have an older brother, so that had kind of come to fruition until I was born. So both being female and a successful birth after a challenging miscarriage were reasons why the name Eliana, God has answered me, was the chosen name. And my last name is Leader, like follow the leader or take me to your leader or leader of the pack. And I never really thought at first about the weight that name would have for me and the way in which I felt really strongly connected to it until I was getting married and I had the option before me of changing my name. And then all of a sudden there was something that really that worried me about losing the opportunity to stay connected to this name, where I really loved it. And it also helped me feel like I was making a mark on something that I wanted to say about myself, that I really had leadership and I had an opportunity to be a leader in the Jewish community. And that really meant a lot to me. Also, what if I, ever become president someday? You really can't get better than having leader associated with you if you're, going to be running for president someday. So you never want to lose that chance. Just in case, I need to have my options open. Is there anyone who would like to perhaps share in the chat about their name? And then I can share it here on the recording. If not, I am going to go into the chat to see. But if not, I recognize we are doing this as a recording, and so we can also keep those personal. So what I am going to do is continue to move on, but for those who are in our meeting right now, and for those who are going to be watching later, I would like for you to think about that origin story for yourself and how they might be some of the initial defining moments of who you are Jewishly and who you might be to your community. So, oh, I got one chat. Sorry about that. Having trouble. Oh, sorry, I am having trouble getting to the chat while I'm sharing.
Nope. Eliana, I can read the chats for you.
Yes, and so apologies. So Harvey was saying that he thinks about his Hebrew name, not his civil name, when you ask about your name, and I love that, which is interesting because it might be that when you think about your own name and you think about your identity, it is personal to where it might not necessarily be the name that others name you, right? Or use for you in a professional setting, but really thinking about the name that you kind of name yourself and that you think of for yourself. Emily, if was there anything else that I should be sharing? I'm just having.
Nope, that was the only comment so far.
Thank you. So in thinking about what makes for a meaningful experience, right? Whether it is a Jewish experience or any experience that we think of as a moment in time that we are learning or we are interacting with. Experiences are really comprised of two parts. They're the content of the experience, right? What we are experiencing, and then the methodology, how we are experiencing it. So, for example, right, I love using, there are just a million examples of sticky experiences in Judaism, but one that I always love thinking about is Havdalah, right? So if you think about Havdalah, the content there is actually the blessings, that transition from the content of going from Shabbat back into the week, and the ritual is the methodology, right? How we are experiencing that formal marking of time of saying we are going to go from Shabbat and do a ritual into getting back into the week. And how we are experiencing it is through so many senses, right? We are using fire to be able to see, and we are smelling the experience, and we're tasting the experience, and we're hearing the experience with the blessings. And you might be moving, right? You might be swaying, you might be holding a siddur. There are just so many ways in which you might have an experience to this transition, where actually the content of it, the content is the information that you are receiving. It's this official marking of time. So thinking about that example, that's a perfect way of thinking about how, as whether you are an educator or whether you are in an experience that's being facilitated for you. Educators, I like to think of, because I like wine, are kind of like sommeliers, right? If you go to a restaurant and you're having a delicious dinner, something I really like to do is I like to ask the person who does the cocktails and the wine, they are the professionals in that experience, and I ask them to pair a glass of wine for me with my meal. They know how to take the flavors of what I'm eating and what I like, and they can pair it with a wine that might help elevate my experience of my meal. They have taken the time to learn about all the wines that are there at the restaurant and what might make them different from one another, how the flavor of that wine might impact the flavor of my meal. And so they can pair it so that I have the best relationship between my drink and my food that I might be able to have. And so thinking about that for educators, when we think about meaningful moments, the best educational moments rather are when the person who is facilitating that experience, and I want to be clear that I'm using the term educator to say to reference that person who is facilitating an experience. You might be a formal educator, right? You might be a teacher and you might have a degree, or you might be the person who is responsible for the experience. And so that could be whether you're in your own home and you're a parent to a child, or to a friend, or it might be in a more formal experience, or you might be God and the Jewish people, right? There are a lot of different ways where you're responsible for making sure that someone has an impactful experience and takes knowledge away from that experience, and that makes you the educator in that situation. So everybody gets to be an educator at some point, and please put yourself in that mind frame as we go through this conversation. So, so the person who is facilitating that experience, that educator, is going to do their best to take the content and say, how can I make this content as sticky as possible? Sometimes it might be senses, sometimes it might be the environment, and we're going to go through different types of methodologies together today before we then go into what I think of as one of our most pivotal experiences, the receiving of the Torah, which just has an extreme amount of methodologies. There are a variety of ways that you can experience that moment. But in thinking about how have we paired this content and the information we are going to receive with a way in which to receive it. And as we go through, if you do have any questions, please place them in the chat, and Emily will be able to let me know when it is time for me to address those. So, methodology. We just talked about this a little bit in terms of its general definition, but in order for it to be successful, to have the right method of learning, it needs to meet the following criteria. It needs to have two very specific things. The selected medium is intrinsically connected to the content. So thinking about the Passover Seder, if anybody was just part of a Passover Seder, or you ran one at home, or even if you had one on Zoom, the Haggadah really outlines a very distinct way of us having a Passover Seder. And if you think about the fact that we use different methodologies in the Seder to really reinforce the story, right? We have foods that represent slavery. We make movements to represent that we're free. All of those different pieces are mediums that specifically tie to the content being the story of the Exodus from Egypt. The second most important piece of the criteria is that the selected methodology needs to appeal to each learner type. So that can be some of the trickiest pieces for an educator or someone who is facilitating a group experience. Everybody is a different type of learner, and you might have multiple types of learners in a group, and each of those learners have a different way of learning. So as an example, in school, right, you may have learned how to memorize a list of something, whether it is all 50 states or the table of contents or the capital of states. For me, I actually in day school learned every single parsha, right, every single Torah portion in order for the entire Torah, because I learned it in song, and I tend to be very musically oriented. And so if I learn something in song, I'll probably remember it forever. So, so that was a great method for me to be able to connect that. That doesn't work for everybody all the time. So being able to be flexible or think about multiple methodologies to be able to connect to the content and to the learners. The use of space and environment is another really important consideration in putting a meaningful experience together. Because by intentionally planning how to use real or imagined space, a learning experience can be enhanced. So good use of space and environment can invite creativity. So for example, if you are asking someone to paint something from the heart and they are sitting in a cubicle, it might not be the right space, but are you putting them in an environment where they might be inspired? To contribute to the subject matter. So perhaps, for example, if you are in a communal prayer, have you designed the space so that all the voices feel like it is one connected prayer? Does it allow educators to adapt to individual needs? So the use of the space, if you are in a classroom setting, for example, and it's frontal and everybody's at tables together, and then you have one learner who maybe needs to be separated from the group, do you have space in your environment to be able to take care of an individual need as it arises? And heightens concentration. So if you are asking someone to take a test, right? Are you going to ask those who are taking an SAT to do it outside on the front lawn in front of a busy highway? Or are you having them placed in a formal and quiet setting where they might be able to concentrate on the test? So thinking about, and if you take a moment to think about truly any experience, right? Like prayer, if you think about unique prayers spaces, are they designed in a specific way to get you to connect to the content, which is the prayer? If you think about classroom settings, are they designed, and this is actually where the concept of the Montessori system changes a lot from traditional frontal learning, which is the idea of allowing students to be able to organically interact with their environment and go to different stations and have more autonomy and independence? Or are they going to be in a more traditional setting, which helps a lot of learners who really need a more focused space, and perhaps some of that movement and autonomy is actually distracting? So there are ways in which different types of learners can connect into different environments. And so it's important to think about how perhaps the use of your space and environment heightens concentration, or it might impact the ability to concentrate. So again, that is not necessarily in a formal learning setting. That's any way in which you might want to connect to content. So again, thinking about Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah, that is a very specific, you will see, a very specific use of space and environment. And did it help or harm the experience, perhaps? I have a question here from Rachel. What challenges do you think the space and environment of space brings up? Space of environment of a Zoom space. That is such a great question, because frankly, this is the first time that I've given this session many times, particularly in thinking about Matan Torah and the giving of the Torah, and I've never done it virtually. I've only done it in person. And I have the opportunity to see you, but I didn't have the opportunity to really connect with you in a way that we would in person. I don't know if you are getting a connection in this virtual space of being able to see and hear me in the same way that we would in person. However, I don't always get a chance to have a well-organized list of slides, because oftentimes I'm in an environment where, for example, if I'm giving this class at camp, so I work at Ramat Jerome, and I might be giving it on the first day of a family camp to kind of explain the purpose of the use of a summer camp environment to campers, and I'm talking to parents. We're sitting outside in Adirondack chairs with a piece of paper, and they don't get the benefit of having all of this written out. So there is something to the benefit of the use of Zoom that allows me to share this content with you in a way I don't always get to. In addition, I also get to record it. So I get to share this learning with more people than I might have otherwise.
Eliana?
A chance to do so. Yeah.
Rachel asked a question. What challenges do you think the space and environment of a Zoom space brings up for all of this?
Yeah, I did have it. It did flash for me.
Flash for you, great.
Answering the question. But thank you, Emily. I appreciate it. I know there's a little bit of a delay. So there are benefits and challenges. I also, knew that this was going to be my use of space and environment. Was I going to necessarily choose it? I would have preferred to be in the mountains at Ramat Jerome giving this class at our Beit Midrash in person. And I would have designed the class differently when we were in person. So it also is a question of a chicken egg question, right? Which comes first? Is your space the thing that you know that you're going to have and you design an experience based on the space? Or is the space the kind of thing where you're like, oh, I'm with a group of people and we have to find a place to get together or a place to have the experience, and in the moment, you have to use what you've got, right? So a rain plan, for example. You might need a rain plan, and then your rain plan isn't what you necessarily designed to start with, but you pivot and then you have to make changes to the experience in order to complement that space. So I hope that answered the question. So the next piece that we need to consider in terms of methodology are the types of learners that are in a room. So students, if everybody here is an educator, you might be thinking of students. If you are somebody who facilitates experiences, you know, in your home, with friends, or professionally at work, they might be participants or family members, and they're all going to play different roles in an activity depending on the personality type. So it's important when you think of a meaningful experience, who is in the room. So knowing who is in the room and on Zoom. So Rachel, going back to use of space and environment, my use of space and environment has impacted my ability to successfully know which type of learners. If we had been at a retreat together, I would have had a chance to get to know people before we got into the Zoom space together. Before we got into the room together to have this conversation. So I could have pulled from what I know about people's personalities in order to cater this conversation to their interests and their needs. I now have to make it a little more general, and I don't have the ability to make it as interactive as I would have liked, because I don't have access to the knowledge of the different types of personalities. However, if you do have a chance to know, so this works out well when it is friends or students who you have all year long, or family members, you can complement an experience to know how to interact meaningfully. So people have different, just like they have different personality types, there are different learning types. So you have introverts and extroverts, those who maybe get their energy, right? So if I have learned anything, there was this book, Quiet. I don't know if anybody has read that book, but I read it and it was very insightful, because it taught me that there is no just introvert or just extrovert. We all have a small mix of each of them, which is interesting because in my marriage, I am married to somebody who is significantly quieter than me, but does not need anywhere near as much turnover time to be able to go from one experience to another. After I have this entire day of teaching, I get a lot of energy from teaching and interacting with people and socializing, and then I need some time to watch something really meaningless, like British Bake Off or something like that on Netflix without talking to anybody, in order to refill my battery. So I might be more dynamic in public, but I also have an energy. I need to refill that energy in a way that doesn't get used up, for example, by my husband, where he can just kind of go because he paces in a different way. So thinking about introverts and extroverts, experiences might be about how they interact, or it might be how they fill their well. How do they fill their spiritual well? Might be different than how they interact with other people. So just something to keep in mind. There are also sages and independents, right? So needing an outlet for leadership. This sages and independence immediately makes me think of my oldest daughter, Aria, who desperately always wants to be like the line leader, right? She's 5, but always needs to be, she needs some kind of outlet for leadership. Either she's the one passing out papers in her class, right? It's a constant comment that I'm getting from her teachers, in order to get her to buy into an experience. She has to have a way in which she helps. She likes to help. She's a big helper. Then there are sleepers, right? There's they have less self-initiative. They might need more leadership or peer support. So my daughter, Aria, needs to be the line leader, and she really loves to help. But then there's another child in her class who really benefits from that, because they benefit from her energy, right? The other child is energized from her energy. And again, I think about, I'm going to keep using my family, we're a little dynamic, and diverse rather is what I meant to say. But I think about it when I see my oldest daughter and my younger daughter interact, right? My younger daughter doesn't have the same self-initiative, but she gets a lot of excitement and energy and buy-in to coloring with chalk outside and coming up with these big ideas of what they're like, the mermaids that they're going to draw, because she benefited from the leadership and the direction that her older sister gave her. And then she has the, you know, the space to be independently creative, but she needed that little bit of push. So needed a little more support. And then there are those who are the warriors, the active ones in an experience. They enjoy activities. So they don't necessarily connect to the underlying goals. Zoom is incredibly challenging for these particular types of learners, right? They need those dynamic activities. They need, perhaps, for example, the way in which I started this conversation when I asked you what's in a name, that is even at least a mental activity, right? That was something where I asked you to be active and have some kind of interaction, hopefully, right? So, so that was, just in case we had some active-based learners, there was a way for them to frame their mental space to be able to buy in to continuing on in this experience together in this session, because I know that just getting onto a Zoom class and watching my stack of slides might be incredibly challenging for those particular types of learners. The next part that we need to consider is a typology of experience. And some of these are, you know, sometimes a little more formal in their wording, but hopefully they feel natural when we start explaining them. But at the heart of experiential education are those activities that make and shape the experience. So to assist in the planning of activities, you think about the ingredients or the boundaries that design it. And these are the pieces that you honestly might not even notice as purposeful or intentional, right? So building and creating, so utilizing Legos, right? So having an activity where, you know, if anybody has ever taught Sunday school and then you're learning about the Mishkan, right? So you're building the temple and you have kids and you want them to build it in Minecraft or with Legos, right? Like those are ingredients that you're using in the activity to connect to the content. The suspension of reality, so making believe. Or for example, in summer camp, we start the entire summer camp by changing the time. Why? Because we can. It's not that it's make believe, but it's we are creating our own reality. And there's something about, other than the fact that there's a technical need, right? It gives an extra hour of sunlight, the pool gets to warm up a little bit. The youngest kids go to sleep at 8 o'clock and it, you know, they'll go into their bunks at 8 o'clock and it's actually dark because it's really 9 o'clock, right? So their ability to be able to, they don't necessarily know all the reasoning behind the ingredient, but they know that there's this magic suspension of reality that we are something different and we have this different world for ourselves outside of this bubble, because in this bubble, we decided to change time and we use that as something really powerful in a learning moment. Creating a sense of journey or destination. So I see this a lot with Israel educators. I still to this day, it was actually so impactful for me. I still to this day remember in preschool, this was one of my first experiential moments that I can remember. We walked into a classroom that our teachers had made into an El Al airplane. So they had like painted the sides to make it look like an airplane. I was like 4. They put the chairs in rows to be the aisles. They gave us Bamba snacks. So we all had, this was, you know, when you could still eat peanuts in school, but we had like an Israeli snack that we had on the airplane. And then in front of us, because it was the 80s, we had this big TV that was playing a VHS of what it looked like to fly over Israel. And so we had, and that was my first introduction to Israel, was, quote, getting on a plane. I got an El Al pin, right, the wings. I was greeted with shalom, right, and the Hebrew, and got the snacks. And there was something about that journey and the destination that really, this was decades and decades ago, and I can still remember a little bit of what it looked like because that journey was so impactful to me. And then the last is stretching personal boundaries and taking risks, right? So thinking about this might be a harder time because we are zoomed out to be thinking about Zoom as this tool of stretching people's boundaries and taking risks. But I can tell you, as somebody who does not typically teach and record themselves, that for myself, right, utilizing this as a method is stretching my own personal boundaries. It's making me think about how I can provide content to you in a meaningful way, and it's a risk for me. Right. So how might you think in an activity about taking people out of their comfort zones, not to scare them, but perhaps to wake them up to the experience? This one is something that certainly, I used Havdalah as the example at the beginning, and this really reinforces it. This idea of sensory education. So thinking about senses, they represent the connection and relationship between the inner person and the outer world. So the senses are the ones that we know, right? Smell and touch and taste and hearing. And the beauty and the reasoning for that is, first of all, there is a whole person involvement, right? When you think about Havdalah, there is no element of you that isn't part of the experience. You might be standing, right? And you might be swaying. Your nose is part of the experience. Your eyes are part of the experience. Your ears and your hands, right? All of it is part. Your skin, feeling the warmth of the candle, right? You are so fully enveloped in it. It really creates a stickiness. So there are synapses that really fire and are really reconnected every time you use one of your physical senses. It's why, with babies, that they can smell the milk and it helps connect them to know where to go for food, right? There is really something about using our physical senses that creates a stickiness inside of our brains that anchors what we're doing to that moment. It also allows you to do multiple things at once. So going again, back to this example of Havdalah, because I love it, you are doing both many blessings, you are creating a multimodal ritual, and you're getting a lot of information all at the same time because you're using multiple senses in that experience. You are both seeing the light and tasting the wine and singing the song all at the same time. And then there are emotional responses. If I asked you to close your eyes and think about when you were a child and what it was like when you first maybe woke up in the morning and smelled breakfast, right? And started your day. You might have this experience that you could share with me, or I might say to you, tell me a story of Seder growing up for you. What was Seder like if you celebrated Passover when you were growing up? And you might tell me the story of every year we would go to my grandparents' house and we would make gefilte fish from scratch together. And that fish was so stinky, but it was so interesting to get my hands into the mixture, and it felt so, and all of those conversations about the smells and the tastes and the feelings really bring you back somewhere. I could tell you, what an orange smells like in theory. But if I ask you to smell an orange right now, you can't necessarily do so. But you have the memory of an orange because you have smelled the orange. Hopefully that makes sense and has, so we have those same kinds of opportunities for emotional responses. The more, the warmth of the smell of challah coming out of the oven and getting excited for Shabbat, right? So when I smell challah, it could be a Tuesday and I get excited for Shabbat. There is something about smelling that challah coming out of the oven that gets me excited. This last piece, these multiple intelligences, is thinking back again when we talked about ways in which people connect to different pieces of information. So when you think and learn in different ways, there are a lot of educational theories on it, but this particular one about multiple intelligences, it was created by Howard Gardner at Harvard University, and it's thinking about a framework for organizing and reflecting on curriculum assessment and pedagogical practices. This reflection invites educators to develop approaches that better suit the needs of the range of learners. Everybody has multiple intelligences. So think back for a moment when you're in school and you have to get ready for a test, right? Were you a flashcard? Did you need flashcards? Were you the type who recorded classes and you needed to hear them? Did you write notes in an outline, right? All of those, the ways in which, and these come naturally. We can look at this list and everybody has the opportunity to see the list in front of them. But even if you're not looking at the list, you would naturally know. There are certain multiple intelligences that you have inside of yourself that you're like, oh, that one is really something for me, right? So I told you earlier, music, right? So music was really something, music and rhythm are a multiple intelligence I personally really connect to. It helps me when I used to memorize vocabulary words when I was younger in song, right? Again, I still know all the Pardes in order because of the song I learned in first grade. There are ways in which that intelligence for me is very strong. I also, though, am very verbal. I really like talking and having deep conversations, and that's how I really connect to people in person. I might not be as visual or spatial, right? I don't need to necessarily visualize the experience. I like to talk it out and think through the big picture and get down to the narrow, and having that conversation for me is a way that I'm able to make it come to life. I don't necessarily need to see it. Other people, so again, I will use my husband because oftentimes our exact opposites are helpful in these conversations. He is very much a visual learner in that he is a product designer. So he professionally is an industrial designer where he sketches literally everything. He was putting up bookshelves in our house, and he designed a 3D sketch for me on the computer to show me exactly what it was going to look like and the exact spacing between the shelves so that I would be able to approve the project, right? So that is his mode. He will design things, he will sketch them, he will put them in pictures, and that's the way that he learns and understands the world. Okay, so what we are going to do now is we are going to, now that I'm going to take a quick pause so that as we have just gone through all of these different methodologies, I gave you a lot of content that was more technical to be able to explain all the kind of complicated and different areas that we are considering as we go into thinking about the text, the actual text of the receiving of the Torah. So we're going to look at it together, and if you don't have it in front of you, there are a variety of ways that you can get it. But if you go to ramadarom.org/Pardes, where all of our source sheets are located, you will see, if you scroll down a bit, there's a section that's called source sheets, and you open it up, and there's one called Smelling Mount Sinai. And that is the one that just has the source sheet is the text directly from Exodus to be able to, and hopefully that was.
I just posted it in the comments also.
Perfect, thank you. And I am also going to, as we're reading, I'm going to switch my screen to be able to share that text on the screen, and then I'll come back to the slides. But what we're going to do is I just shared a bunch of different pieces that one might consider in terms of creating that sommelier pairing, right? Thinking about the content, thinking about the people, thinking about the experience and the space and the types of learners who are there, and merging them all together, those methodologies with the content being the Torah, or the giving of the Torah rather. And how, I just have to say, like, props to God, because this is the most, and there's a time where, you know, if I'm in a workshop with educators, I'll have a bunch of different cards of these methodologies to be able to have a bunch of different examples of the different types of methodologies. And my argument is you could take any single methodology or an example of a methodology and find a place in the text where God utilizes it. So you might say that's a little bit of an overload, right? Like that is a lot of methodology, and that is true. But to be fair, there are also a lot of people there, and everybody was being asked, and this is what we need to reflect on when we're thinking about Shavuot. Everyone was being asked to accept the Torah for themselves and see the Torah for themselves, right? To really say, this is something that I buy into. Yes, we are having it as a communal experience, but actually this was brought up. I can't remember who said it, I'm sorry, in the last panel, but something that yes, we talk about it a lot of times, that we accepted the Torah together. But the truth is, not only did we have to accept it together, in order to accept it together, we individually had to buy in. And you see that every day as well, even now, right? From then until now, there are so many ways that we experience Torah, or we commit to Torah, or we buy into Jewish practice, even when our community is not with us, right? What prayers do we say? Do we say prayers? Do we keep kosher, right? Do we only keep kosher when we're in front of other people, or is it a practice that we have committed for ourselves? The ways in which we might commit to learning Jewish text, the ways in which we might commit to making blessings on different things, right? There are so many ways in which we might be anchored in a communal experience for both the receiving and accepting of and expressing and living the Torah, but all of it is really built on a platform of our own personal commitment to the experience as well. And the only way we could commit to it personally is we find some sticky moment for ourselves in that experience. So because I need to pivot, where typically I would have everybody go around and we would read the text together, because it is our text. It is a text that we all own. Instead, I am going to read the text aloud, and I'm going to read it in English. However, the PDF that I sent over has both the original Hebrew and it also has the English. So I would love for you to follow along. I'm going to read it a little bit dramatically to try and suss out some of what I'm talking about these different methodologies that we just went through. So as you're reading the text, think through these questions that I've posted here, which is, what kind of methodologies did God use at Matan Torah, right? Do you see the senses? Do you see the type of learners? Do you see the use of space and environment? Does this experience invite you into a holy relationship? This might not necessarily be a yes, right? It could be a yes for some, it could be a no for others. And we need the rest of the Torah and the rest of our collective experience, because we needed to warm up to the idea of this holy relationship. So why or why not? Why or why not in terms of being able to see an invitation to a relationship there? It's a little bit of it's definitely a personal, everybody reads it in a different way. How does this experience feel personal? How does it feel collective? So do you see individuals being asked to participate in this experience or connect to it in a certain way in one way? And then does the collective experience it in another way or in tandem? And then thinking, if you were God, or if you were going to be giving God some recommendations on perhaps how to do a redo on Matan Torah, what might you have changed? What might you have designed differently in terms of the experience? I know that that's a little bit of a bold thing to say, but we are Jews and we have opinions. And so the truth is, if you were to think about this experience and you were to be the one to design it, right? If it had been a plotted out experience, would you have done it differently? Would you have added something in? Would you have taken something out? Is it a little much? Or is it just right? It needed all of the intensity of the experience in order to be as memorable as it is, so that we're talking about it thousands of years later and it still feels applicable. So I'm going to, if anybody has any questions as I switch over to the PDF, please post it in the chat. And I am just going to quickly grab the source sheet. Okay. I'm going to now share this source sheet on the screen. And please give me a thumbs up when you can see it. Are you able to see the source sheet? Excellent. All right, thank you. So I'm going to make it a little bigger, if I can. Yes, there we go. All right. So in reading it in English, slightly dynamically, on the third new moon, after the Israelites had gone forth from the land of Egypt, on that very day, they entered the wilderness of Sinai. Having journeyed from Rephidim, they entered the wilderness of Sinai and encamped in the wilderness. Israel encamped there in front of the mountain. And Moses went up to God. The Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, "Thus shall you say to the house of Jacob, and declare to the children of Israel, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to me. Now then, if you will obey me faithfully and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all the peoples. Indeed, all the earth is mine, but you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the children of Israel." Moses came and summoned the elders of the people and put before them all that the Lord had commanded him. All the people answered as one, saying, "All that the Lord has spoken we will do." And Moses brought back the people's words to the Lord. And the Lord said to Moses, "I will come to you in a thick cloud, in order that the people may hear when I speak with you, and so trust you ever after." Then Moses reported the people's words to the Lord. And the Lord said to Moses, "Go to the people and warn them to stay pure today and tomorrow. Let them wash their clothes. Let them be ready for the third day. For on the third day, the Lord will come down in the sight of all the people on Mount Sinai. You shall set bounds for the people round about, saying, beware of going up the mountain or touching the border of it. Whoever touches the mountain shall be put to death. No hand shall touch him, but he shall be either stoned or shot. Beast or man, he shall not live. When the ram's horn sounds a long blast, they may go up on the mountain." Moses came down from the mountain to the people and warned the people to stay pure, and they washed their clothes. And he said to the people, "Be ready for the third day. Do not go near a woman." Commentary to the side. On the third day, as morning dawned, there was thunder and lightning and a dense cloud upon the mountain, and a very loud blast of the horn, and all the people who were in the camp trembled. Moses led the people out of the camp toward God, and they took their places at the foot of the mountain. Now Mount Sinai was all in smoke, for the Lord had come down upon it in fire. The smoke rose like the smoke of a kiln, and the whole mountain trembled violently. The blare of the horn grew louder and louder. As Moses spoke, God answered him in thunder. The Lord came down upon Mount Sinai on the top of the mountain, and the Lord called Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. The Lord said to Moses, "Go down, warn the people not to break through to the Lord to gaze, lest many of them perish. The priests also who come near the Lord must stay pure, lest the Lord break out against them." So I hope everyone enjoyed my dramatic reading. Props to me. But I do it on purpose so that you can see some of the example of what I'm saying about the use of an intense amount of methodology here. I'm going to go back to these questions that I was saying about when you're thinking about reading in the text. And here I would love if anybody wants to shoot anything into the chat if they so choose, but I'm going to keep going, right? Thinking about the kinds of methodologies God used at Matan Torah. I have to say, when I first really started looking at this with an educator's eye and thinking about the methodologies, all of the sounds, right? First of all, my favorite part, hands down, is that if anybody has heard a shofar before, does a shofar get louder and louder the longer it goes, Or do the people who are doing a loud blast, especially that long one, the longer it goes and they have a harder time and their breath they start getting out of breath and they don't know what to do. And then it just gets like into a tiny, tiny sound because it's really hard to keep that long blow keep going, right? But here, there's a magic, right? There is a suspension of reality. The mountain is shaking and there is smoke on a mountain without being able to see fire, right? It's just the smoke. And you have shofar blasts that get louder and louder the longer they go rather than getting thinner. And there is this use of space and environment. There is a suspension of reality. There is here, what's interesting to me is also, there are ways that people are supposed to come together, that they're supposed to feel pure and prepared. But then there's also an intimidation factor that's being used, right? There's like a trembling, and there's the warnings about not going near the mountain and you might perish, right? And there's a use of intensity here that actually makes for this like really, some might feel like it's scary, others might feel in awe, right? Because if you think about royalty and how others might use this, you will love me if you fear me type of design, right? Where the fear can create some kind of awe or inspiration, and that might be being used here. There are ways in which you're asking to have your clothing changed and your personal practices changed, about your relationships to other people and desisting from them so that you're totally focused on the task at hand, which is to develop this relationship with God and with Torah, and to focus solely on that experience in that way. Right? Like once I started thinking about all the different elements that needed to go into this experience so that it could connect to different types of people. Think about those introverts and extroverts that were in the crowd, right? Some might have really appreciated all the smells and sounds and all the people, and other people might have appreciated being asked to take a personal moment, right? And to desist from personal relationships and having a mental moment to gather and collect themselves before participating in Matan Torah. And maybe they needed that separation in order to get themselves, right, have that spiritual well filled, the way that I was sharing, when I need to recharge my own battery, for example, and I need that personal space. So there are a lot of different ways where the methodologies were used in Matan Torah are varied, and they think about both a personal experience so that there's something for everyone, but then that pivotal moment is a collective one. Everyone's there at Matan Torah. They're all standing there. They're all hearing that shofar blast. They're all smelling the smoke, right? And that's why I call it smelling Mount Sinai, because when we think about the receiving of the Torah, we might not be thinking about those experiential moments of truly being there. But what's interesting is if you read a lot of commentary on the receiving of the Torah, it says, there's midrash that says every Jewish soul was there, whether they had already been born or they hadn't been born yet, that everyone was there to all receive it throughout time. And if that's true, right? Or if that imagery helps, right? How do we then say, even if it's just words and it's just imagery, but if we are to say we are supposed to learn something from that, it's to say that this text is timeless in its request to have us personally buy in as we read it, right? So even if you're experiencing it for the first time now and you're reading it for the first time now, how do you as an individual claim this moment for yourself? And you can really sense it and you can really feel it. And I would argue that all these typologies of activity and the use of methodologies is I think where the Medrash gets this idea of saying that every single one of us individually buy into it, and we all say Na'aseh v'nishma, right? We all bring it upon ourselves in order to say that the collective did, because we needed to have this personal connection. Now, does it invite you into a holy relationship, right? This moment might be so inspirational that you didn't need anything else, right? Others might feel like this is a formative moment that was certainly sticky, but it could be like many of our other Jewish experiences that we have that aren't necessarily the most positive ones, the moment that we experience them. And it takes that continued relationship, and it takes the request of us continuing to show up for this relationship of ourselves and the Creator, ourselves and the divine, to be able to say that, you know, I had a lot of trouble with Matan Torah. I didn't like that it seemed very like gender othering, and it was very intimidating, and I'm not into, you know, fear and intimidation practices as a way to have a relationship with me, and I need something different from you. And it's the tension of the experience that might be how we buy into continuing a conversation, because there's a place to start, and that place to start is sometimes not the happiest place to start, but it is formative and it is sticky. And so I want to encourage in this conversation that it's not necessarily always about a positive or negative. Sometimes experiences need to be jarring in order to be sticky, so that you can also remember them forever. Not necessarily like heartbreaking, right? Or destructive, but jarring, challenging, right? So when we talk about the methodology of asking learners to get outside of their comfort zone and pushing their boundaries, how might a design that isn't so loving and isn't so touchy-feely, how might that be actually a beneficial way to ask people to have a sticky connection to that experience, so that it guides them in, and they need that challenge in order to stick with it, and because the challenge is what drives them. And so I encourage you to think through that. And if you were to have designed the experience differently, both for yourself, what would you have needed at Matan Torah? Was it there for you in the text? Was it not there for you in the text? If you're thinking about for just yourself, and then also for the collective, was this the right design for everybody to experience at the same time? Was it powerful enough? I think based off of the amount of time from then until now, and we're still talking about it, I could make the immediate argument that yes, it was formative and intense enough to where the design of the experience was the right one to keep the conversation live. But perhaps there was something missing for you that helps you take a step on your Jewish journey today to continue to connect to Torah. And so I'd like to use the last few minutes, if anybody has a question or would like to share on your reflections, because the last but acharon chaviv, it is last but always the most important and really formative, is that when you have an experience, you need to have time to reflect on that experience in order for it to really be received. If you think about, if you've ever gone to a yoga class, so I've done a good amount of yoga classes, and there's a part at the end, right, where you've done your entire yoga practice, whether it was a light, stretchy one or it was a sweaty one, they all end the same, where you take a moment to allow your body to kind of reshape into this state, and you lie there and you close your eyes and you give yourself some time to breathe. And you go into a shavasana to be able to say, I'm going to reflect on my practice today. And that is what every experience needs. Yoga does it really well in having a very specific way of being able to use it as an example, but Torah and learning experiences also need that moment of reflection. Okay, so as you reflect, we are going to stay quiet for a few moments so that we have space for this reflection. But I'm going to leave these questions up, and I'm going to read them, and then we're going to stay quiet. If there is anything that you would like to share with the group or place into the chat, now is the time. But in going through this journey together of talking about methodologies and smelling Mount Sinai together the way that we just did the Torah seem exciting or intimidating to you? What next step will you take to incorporate what you have learned into your work? So whether that is your work of keeping a home, the work of being an educator, the work of perhaps leading HR experiences at your office, any area, right? Whether you are a formal educator, you're an experiential educator, or you are put into a position of leadership where you are guiding others. How will you take what you've learned here today and incorporate it into a next step for yourself? And then finally, going back to the very first conversation that we had about our names, right? Then I asked you to think about one of the first moments of your own Jewish identity, or a step on your Jewish journey in your name, but it brought you to the communal table of having a Jewish identity and thereby being part of the collective. And so how do you continue from this moment to bring your Jewish story to the communal table? I'm going to give us a few seconds. Please share anything you would like in the chat. So we are almost out of time together. There was a comment and thank you for everybody for the comments that you shared in the chat. There was one that was asking about reading Ruth at Shavuot and how that story contrasts and complements Matan Torah as a learning experience, which I find very interesting because it is a very independent and very specific story. So it is easily contrastable with the collective because it looks at one unique Jewish journey. But I would argue it is a unique Jewish journey into the collective, right? It is someone who struggles with this idea of the buy-in and being able to see themselves as part of the Jewish community, and getting the permission to be part of the Jewish community, and how that might, looking at someone's individual experience, might also provide space to have a collective understanding, right? Do you feel seen from Ruth's story? Whether her story is your story, can you relate to her story? Can you relate to the struggles? Can you relate to what she goes through and the both physical and mental and spiritual journey that she takes to be able to find her place in the collective? So while it is an individual story, it's a very universal one in a lot of ways. And then in contrast, because there's a lot to compare and contrast there, and I agree it could easily be its own class, but then Matan Torah is designed as a collective experience, and it asks you to take it personally. And so so the question might be opposite there, right? Because we're receiving different texts at Shavuot to compare and to analyze, and both of them are part of the holiday. But where might we conclude, right? If it's collective to universal, if it's individual to universal or universal to individual, where do they cross for you? Where might those two things come together for you? And that'll be a different place for everyone. But what I would say is it doesn't work if they are parallel experiences or separate experiences. So what can we learn from digging it, right? When we talk about the forest for the trees, how can we look at this kind of one tree, this one story, and see ourselves as part of it? And then also, where do we look at this whole forest of this whole experience of the receiving of the Torah and be able to narrow down to saying, oh, I can place myself right there in that moment. And there should be a moment of intersection for you there. And it'll be different